Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Happy Cynics. And today we're going to delve into talking about the psychology of revolutions and revolutionaries. But before we get started, I've got an important announcement to make, and Isaac is unaware of this because I didn't tell him. But I had a vision from God last night, and I need to pass this message on to everybody.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, well, I know, you're all ears
up
now.
Yeah,
so this is, I'll see if I can deliver this message. Thus saith the Lord, I am the Lord your God. Because you have forsaken me and the teachings of my Son, and have embraced the son of perdition as your political candidate, I will now send a plague of locusts to destroy all of your crops and to lay eggs in your arms and to attack your children and do all kinds of unspeakable ills in your sight. I am the Lord your God. Well, anyway, let this get down on record now. Here we are, May 14th, we're recording this. See if there aren't a plague of locusts on the way. I got a feeling.
Are you talking about the trillion cicadas that are about to emerge?
Yes. Yeah. So anyway.
Oh man.
Yes. I received a revelation about that last night. God is sending a plague of locusts to punish us. So everybody get ready. They are around the corner. Amy and I already
protect your eardrums. They get really loud.
They do. Mating calls. Well, anyway, we put netting over all of our good plants that we want to protect. So if you haven't done so, you might want to do that. So, all right. Viva la revolution. Okay, let's get into the revolutions. Now, you did some character studies, right, Isaac?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that I've been doing character studies on revolutionaries my whole life.
Okay.
I've always loved reading biographies.
All right.
But yeah, for this specifically, I looked into a few that I think are generally misunderstood, especially in the American public.
Okay.
The primary one being Che Guevara.
Uh-huh.
Mostly because there was a trend of wearing the t-shirts, and even Converse, Chuck Taylor's put out a shoe with him on it.
Oh.
And, this was years ago, but there was a big reaction against him following his, that image of him becoming popular in the culture. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Why don't you do that? I did some research on a couple of, there's a more recent work on the psychology of revolution. And this was, let's see. I'll have to look up the author's name. Fatali Moghadam. So anyway, this is a more recent. This was just published March 7th this year. So the psychology of revolution. So we will talk about that here in a little bit. All right, go ahead, Isaac. Where do you want to start?
I want to start about the public perception.
Okay.
Of some of these revolutionaries.
Right.
When we talk about people like Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, even some of the other Latin American figures like the Zapatistas, and even back in the Mexican Revolution with Emiliano Zapata.
Right.
I think a lot of these guerrilla type revolutionaries, or even the Viet Cong, these groups are cast as terrorist organizations.
Right.
And so anytime that they do anything that's even vaguely military that involves the death of other people, they are cast as mass murderers.
Right. Right.
If you consider their perspective and the perspective of non-American historians, a lot of times they were doing the exact same things that the other side of the war is doing, because it's just part of war. So, if you are in a battle and you kill people, that's just part of revolution.
Okay.
When it's violent.
All right.
Right. So I want to say Che Guevara, I don't want to say oh, he's a great person, I do want to say he's a great person, but I don't want to sign off on everything he ever said or everything he ever did. But I do want to say that he's not a villain in history, and he's actually quite inspirational and somebody whose model should be followed by those wishing to change society. He was, kind of a middle-class young man in Argentina.
Mm-hmm.
Got his doctorate, was a medical licensed doctor, and when he was in his early 20s, he went on a motorcycle trip throughout Latin America and South America. And that trip changed his life because he saw how United States imperialism was causing the suffering of the peasant class in South America and Latin America.
Right.
He wrote a very famous book on this. Let me look for it. I want to get the Motorcycle Diaries.
Oh, okay.
Which is that's his own account of this trip that he took.
Okay.
So, and then he even went to Miami as part of this trip.
Okay. Right.
So he saw, and this was the 40s, late 40s, early 50s when this happened. So he saw the mistreatment of black people in America,
mm-hmm.
and then the mistreatment of farmers in South America and Latin America. He became a revolutionary, a communist. He described himself as a Marxist-Leninist. The short version of the story is that he joins up with Fidel, overthrows the Cuban government against, that was backed by American military forces.
Right.
By rallying the Cuban people around their cause. So the Cuban Revolution strategy, the Castro and Guevara and the others, their strategy was to get up into the mountains, into the foothills, outside of the cities, and get these peasant workers to join their cause.
Right.
And that is how the Cuban Revolution succeeded. After the Cuban Revolution, Castro and Guevara were not close buddies.
Right.
So a lot of stuff you'll read about Guevara is actually stuff that Castro did.
Mm-hmm.
Now, and the biggest difference was Castro really wanted to align himself with the USSR because he knew that he needed a global superpower to back him.
Right.
Or they were doomed to fail.
Right.
Guevara didn't like foreign intervention in Cuba.
Right.
So, but then after the Cuban Revolution, Guevara spends his time doing land reform. He heads up a literary initiative to spread literacy amongst the Cuban people. So I think in the course of 9 months through this program, literacy goes from 40% up to 95%.
All right.
Of Cuban people, which is higher than most first world countries, even.
Right. Yeah. You got to be able to read all that communist propaganda.
Yeah, of course. You got to be able to read Marx.
Go ahead. Sorry, I had to throw that in there. Anyway,
I think
that is a good thing. That's a wonderful thing. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think the important part of understanding Guevara is that he wasn't some brutal, violent person.
Right.
Which is a lot of the propaganda portrays him as this mass murderer
mm-hmm.
who hated gay people and the blacks, which is not true. And when you really look at him, he's more of a student. He's very much a bookworm. He's not this bombastic character.
Not a thug.
He doesn't have a lot of, he's not a thug. He's very much a doctor and someone who's very intelligent. I mean, if you go back, you can find recordings of speeches he gave at the UN, and he served as an ambassador for Cuba following the war.
Right.
Then eventually he gets tired of political life in Cuba. So he's not power hungry because he voluntarily leaves the Cuban government when he probably could have been a major political player, to leave and go start revolutions elsewhere in the world, which he goes to Africa to do that.
Right.
And then eventually he gets assassinated because of his involvement in these other international revolutions.
Yes.
So that's Guevara. I think he is a sort of template for the revolutionary mindset, because he made sacrifices in his personal life for people that he was not part of their political class. right? He's not a Cuban. Right. He was never a peasant. He was well educated. He was upper middle class growing up. It was really his contact with the poor that changed something in his heart.
Right.
That made him willing to sacrifice basically his entire life for their cause.
Yes.
And I think that is really the quality of a revolutionary, is that like almost hyper compassion for the poor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it seems like Guevara, I guess I'm pronouncing that. I don't know if I'm pronouncing. I've always heard it Che Guevara, but I don't know if that's correct
how I've
or
heard
not.
It too. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I don't really know. I'm not sure. It does seem like in revolutions, well, I mean, you could see this even like in terms, and I'm going to talk about Protestant Reformation, because that comes up in Le Bon's book. But not everybody joins the revolution for the same reasons. So you have some people that are doing it for humanitarian reasons. And I've always kind of looked at Guevara as he did this stuff for more humanitarian reasons. He was trying to champion the cause. Now, people can disagree on, what's the best way to help the poor and this and that and the other thing. But like you were saying, from what I've read, it doesn't appear he wasn't looking to be a part of a new regime. Okay. That was, and I don't want to get ahead and talk about, but Castro, that was where I think Castro kind of had, it all like maybe mixed motives, in the revolution, or even if he started out with humanitarian ones, does that power corrupt? And that sometimes people argue that. I don't know. I as an American, I guess you'd have to live in Cuba to know, was a real, how were things better and worse and all of that. I mean, you can't argue with statistics as far as literacy rates and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, modern Cuba has a lower infant mortality rate than America.
Right.
The United States. And Cuban doctors are sent all over the world because of their renown in medical expertise.
Right. Okay. But yeah. All right. So what's your analysis of him then?
Of Castro?
Well, if you wanted to say anything else on Guevara before moving on to Castro.
I think Castro is another interesting character because he does claim political power for the rest of his life.
Right.
But I've seen interviews with modern Cubans who lived through his entire political rise to power, and he's generally loved to this day amongst Cubans.
Well, yeah, I think from what I've read and heard, from him in interviews, I think he saw himself as the benevolent dictator. That was kind of his modus operandi.
Yeah, for me, my critique of Castro is that he never really implemented any form of democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are some democratic systems in Cuba, but it's not a true democracy. It is a dictatorship.
Right.
But it's a dictatorship that did significant things for the people of Cuba. There were significant land reforms. Everybody had a dignified life. Housing reforms. There are no homeless people in Cuba. I mean,
well, that's what I think that's what a lot of Trump supporters think will happen under Trump.
Yeah. The problem is that once that benevolent dictator is out of the picture, the centralization of power, I think, lends itself to corruption to someone who's maybe less idealistic.
Yeah.
So, there's a mixed bag. Now you have Raul Castro now in power in Cuba, who's sort of carrying the torch forward.
Right.
And under Obama, it seemed like our relationships with Cuba were going to improve.
Yes.
Which I've seen the response of Cubans tended to be negative towards that because they didn't want to have capitalism.
Right.
So at the same time, they wanted the luxuries of American life. So internet is a little bit hard to come by in Cuba.
Yeah. So close, but no cigar.
Yeah. Well, and then Trump obviously shut all that down. And it's something to say that like the Cuban Revolution has survived for 80 years of an embargo.
Yeah. Right.
So it's got to have some sustainability somewhere and something supporting it. And I think that is the Cuban people that keep Cuba alive.
Right. Right.
So, but I think when we're looking at Cuba, it's definitely Che who's the real revolutionary, right? Because he doesn't stay in Cuba. It's not about just Cuba for Che. It's about the revolution itself.
Yes. Yes. Right. Right. Well, yeah, that's, there's a difference. Well, let's put it this way. I don't know, like, how many of these leaders have like a type of Messiah complex that they distrust, that the system is going to be able to produce responsible leadership. And so in their minds, they've got to retain their power in order to even protect the people. Because, I mean, and that's part of the mindset, I think, that's going on here in the United States. Trump promised that he was going to drain the swamp, and and so a lot of people think that, a lot of his supporters think that, oh yeah, he's independent of all these powers that be, and then his critics say, no, actually, he's more beholden to them than other presidents have been. So there.
Yeah, I think when we're talking about like the difference between a reactionary and a revolutionary,
right?
Reactionaries are revolutionary about identity, and revolutionaries are revolutionary about policy.
Yeah, that's true. Yes, that is true. I don't want to get ahead of the game here, but Le Bon talks about analyzing the mindset of revolution in terms of change, and the way people are able to adapt. And revolutions come out of, like he claims, that revolutions come about because a certain number of people can't adapt. And so where I kind of disagree with him is he thinks that the people who can't adapt to change are the ones that when they finally do change, they do so through a revolution. I think being on this side, and you know what, I'll put this on the back burner for now, because I want you to go ahead and finish, because actually in talking about all this and the mindset of revolutions and change and all of that, I even want to introduce Thomas Kuhn into this whole discussion. Because I think paradigm shift, change, this is all part of it. And so that's why these two groups are at the polar opposites, pooling. So anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry.
So just to like put a little bow on Guevara, I think you also have to take into account that when he was in Cuba, he had a wife and children,
right? That he
left.
Oh,
basically abandoned to go do these other revolutions.
Wow.
That eventually got him killed. So there is I think a dark side to selling your life to be a revolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
That certain people always are going to be left in the dust.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to interpret that. Is that like Guevara's ego that only he can, maintain the revolution on a worldwide scale, that nobody else could have taken his place so he could, have some loyalty to his family? But
I don't know. I mean, because even from world religions, you have people that are called, like the world changers are the people that have to basically devote their entire energy to that. I mean, you even have some of this in the Gospels where Jesus is like, unless you can leave father, mother, and everybody behind, like you don't have any part of me. Like you have to leave all behind. And Peter says, yes, we have left all behind and all that, which we know wasn't always true in a literal sense. But you have that. You have like the story of the Buddha who he leaves his wife and child behind to go seek enlightenment. And, so you have all this where people have to kind of devote themselves wholeheartedly to the cause. Because, and that's part of the revolutionary mindset. The revolutionary mindset is that change cannot be gradual, or the kind of change that's needed will not happen incrementally. It will only happen through an all-out conflict. And that was part of Marx's analysis.
Yeah, I think another similarity exists there between revolutionaries and reactionaries, which is that their enemy is not really each other. It's the reformers.
Mm-hmm.
It's the gradual,
yes,
we're going to do this through.
Right.
That's who they're the ones getting in the way because, they're giving hope that we can do this without violence. Right?
Well, that's the whole thing going on with Biden right now in the United States.
I mean, that's why people my age,
yes,
who are, a few years ago were very excited about Sanders.
Right.
That's why we hate Biden.
Yeah.
Because he's too gradual. We need change now.
Yeah. He's still protecting too much of the status quo.
Yeah.
Yeah. I get it. I understand. So we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
All right. So you're talking about Castro. I don't know if you still want to talk about him more. Who else did you look at?
So the other people I looked at were the Zapatistas in Mexico, which I think this is a revolutionary group that flies under most people's radar.
Yeah, I don't know much about them.
So they are modeled after the historical figure of Emiliano Zapata. Okay,
right.
Who was an important general during the Mexican Revolution.
Oh, okay. Yes, I do remember that name.
And Zapata's entire political program was land reform. So I don't know how much our audience will know about the Mexican Revolution, but it wasn't like the American Revolution where there were two sides.
Yeah.
It was many, many little Mexican armies vying for control of the Mexican government. And part of the power struggle in Mexico at the time was these landed aristocrats that controlled a huge portion of Mexican land that these peasant farmers were farming.
Yes.
And Zapata came up with this plan to distribute that land amongst the people basically fairly. That was sort of his appeal to the peasantry.
Right.
And so he had wide popular support. Now he's assassinated before the Mexican Revolution comes to an end, but he ends up being the inspiration for a lot of the land reforms in the Mexican Constitution. So that's important context for the Zapatistas today.
Okay.
Which you follow that thread through of land reform in Mexico and agriculture being very important to the peasantry.
Right, right.
And the peasantry in Mexico also being tied up with an indigenous identity of I think it's the Nahuatl people.
Okay.
The Nahua people. Forgive me if I got that wrong. But basically indigenous Mexicans.
Right, right.
In the 90s, when Bill Clinton signed NAFTA into being,
right.
and we all entered into that deal, part of that was in allowing some of these land reforms in the Mexican Constitution to be violated by global capitalism.
Oh.
So the Zapatista movement does predate NAFTA.
Okay.
But NAFTA is what really kind of sparked the whole thing.
I see.
So they go back to the 80s, but when we're talking about what they are today, it's really about responding to NAFTA.
Yeah.
So these Mexican revolutionaries, there aren't superstars. There's no celebrity revolutionaries like other revolutions have. But this group of Mexican revolutionaries in Chiapas started to reclaim land that they saw as being stolen from them.
Right.
So the Mexican government responds with military power supported by the United States government, but they lose. essentially. And the state of Chiapas is now majority controlled by this Zapatista movement, which they have a peace treaty with the Mexican government, but they are not the Mexican government. And they've set up these like small, independent, like almost city states, small town governments that are like decentralized, fully democratic. It's basically an anarchist state with the Zapatistan, like the Zapatismo revolutionaries being the military protection for this group of peasants that lives in Chiapas. And that's the current state up to today. So that happened over 30 years ago, and they have maintained their control over Chiapas since then.
Okay, so what do you think motivates? Okay, yeah, I mean, it's obvious what motivates the revolutionary, but what makes someone decide to support revolution versus, say, just hope for the best or accept things the way they are or try to change things incrementally?
I think it's desperation.
Really? Okay.
For a lot of people. I think when we look at, and I think it's desperation, but also a sense that this could be accomplished.
Okay.
I think that's why you don't see revolutions in America, like the Black Lives Matter protest movement didn't become a widespread revolution, because I think American people understand the extent of the U.S. military in terms of its power, that there would be no viable response to that.
Yeah. I think you're right. It's really interesting, and I'll go ahead and start bringing in Le Bon here a little bit. His analysis of the French Revolution, he's pretty cynical. So the first thing is from the different authors that I read talking about revolution and what constitutes revolution, they actually say that the American Revolution, it should not be called a revolution. That's not really a revolution.
I have also come across that.
Yeah, that it was a war for independence. A war for independence is not a revolution. A revolution is a regime change, if not a change in the system. So at least it's a regime change, but often it involves setting up a new system in place of the old one. But this is where Le Bon claims that, okay, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but just kind of let the cat out of the bag here. He claims that really, in the end, things don't change as much as what people think. And this actually came across this very short poem by William Butler Yeats called The Great Day. Have you ever heard this one? It's very short.
I have not heard it.
It says, "Hurrah for revolution and more cannon shot. A beggar upon horseback lashes a beggar on foot. Hurrah for revolution and cannon come again. The beggars have changed places, but the lash goes on." So
interesting, yeah.
So when it all settles out, and so when Le Bon's talking about this, like one example, I just thought this was really interesting. So for example, he talks about even say, like the Protestant Reformation didn't change as much as what people like often credit it as changing. He says, "Modest in its beginnings, it was at first a simple struggle against the abuses of the clergy, and from a practical point of view, a return to the prescriptions of the gospel. It never constituted, as has been claimed, an aspiration towards freedom of thought. Calvin was as intolerant as Robespierre, and all the theorists of the age considered that the religion of subjects must be that of the prince who governed them." Like, in other words, it wasn't that people really got the right to embrace religion for themselves. It was just gave people more options as to what the monarchs were going to choose as the religion that was going to be in that nation.
Right.
And he talks about how, Calvin was even known for executing heretics like Michael Servetus. Yeah. So anyway,
Well, yeah, same story in like England between the Anglicans and the Catholics.
Yeah.
You know, when the monarchy changes, all of a sudden, all the Anglicans got to die. Well, no, not all the Catholics got to die. No, not all the Anglicans got to die.
Yeah, and I think even Thomas More ended up being put to death.
Yeah.
At one point. Yeah. So I don't want to get ahead. I don't want to get ahead of ourselves here because we could talk about that. But and I do want to talk about that. What do revolutions like? When do revolutions produce lasting change, or when do they just kind of temporarily shake things up, and then they kind of settle down into the same kinds of patterns, but with different people and different roles? Okay.
Yes.
So, I think I've mentioned this before, but there was a Twilight Zone episode in the old 60s Twilight Zone series. I mentioned this before, where Russell Johnson plays this guy. He was the guy who was professor in Gilligan's Island.
Yeah.
He goes back in time. He goes back in time as he steps out in the street. It's the night that Lincoln was going to be shot, and he's trying to warn everybody. So when he comes back to the present, it's nothing's really changed. It's the same. The only thing that's happened is the two guys have switched roles. And this is what Le Bon basically argues, because the thing is, revolutions, they end up changing who plays which parts. But if the mores of a society don't change along with it, then you still end up, everything still settles out with an elite group ruling over the masses. It's only when a society changes its values and the whole society embraces new values that a revolution is going to produce lasting change.
Interesting. So in the case of the Zapatistas, because the Zapatista revolution did affect lasting change. I mean, 30 years is a long time.
Yes.
For a sub-government to exist on a peace treaty with its dominant, it's not recognized as a legitimate state. But it still has power over a chunk of southern Mexico. I think one of the differences is that they weren't really fighting to affect some like new change, to bring in new values. The values of land reform had been baked into Mexican culture for hundreds of years. So I think part of the Zapatistas' success is that it was a traditional revolution, right? Our tradition is that everybody owns their land and farms their own land, and we're not doing cash crops, we're doing subsistence farming. Like that is a rejection of the new capitalist production demands, not a overthrow of an established system. Right.
It's interesting. So Le Bon takes this position that the key thing is how the masses are affected by the revolution. Because you have the people who lead the revolutions. Some of them want to see change that's going to affect average people. Well, let's just say, even to start with, that's what people want. But then once you end up with a new regime, like it's kind of like the prison experiment or whatever. Like once somebody gets into a new role, do they start becoming the abuser? This is what has happened in like these in some of these communist revolutions, like in Russia and then China later on.
Certainly, yeah.
And so it all depends. It all depends on the context and the circumstances, but a lot of it really revolves around the populace. And if the populace doesn't want there to be a new status quo, well, then, that's what's kind of funny is and this will be interesting. This is kind of what I want to maybe hash out with you a little bit here, because I guess the question is, when people want revolution, do they really want revolution, or do they only think they want revolution? What they really want is incremental change, because but they just want a bigger increment than other people do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do think that, like, when you look at, the modern revolutions,
Yes.
they all take place in societies where things are at breaking points already.
Right.
That incremental change has been for the worse for long enough that that is no longer an option. Like, people are dying. People groups are disappearing. That's when revolutions are really, like, ripe, I think. So I don't think that those people who are ripe for revolution want incremental change. I don't think that's an option they see. Right.
No,
and that's why I said, like,
true.
I think desperation is what drives the beginning of a revolution, because you have to be desperate to be willing to do some of the things that a revolution requires. So, like, if you look at, the Viet Cong, the state of living of the peasantry was so bad that those communists that came in and said, listen, you don't have to, give your profits to your overlords or whatever. You don't have to pay your landlords. You don't have to do these things. You can own your own land and be your own boss and stop taking orders from other people. I think, as long as you're willing to participate and support our revolution, these are a reality for you in the future. That is only really possible if people feel like they need that.
Yes. I just really wonder, though. Okay, so for example, and I guess what I'm trying to drive at, I do. Yes, I completely understand what you're saying. So let's say that what sparks a revolution is access to health care. Let's say that there's supposedly we have people that can't afford their medications. Only the wealthy or upper middle class and upper class can afford their medications. And so we have a whole bunch of people at the lower, like, this is what's funny. Like, for example, about the vaccinations, the government, offers free vaccinations, COVID vaccinations. And then you have even a lot of people who are vulnerable to the virus, who, because the government said you have to get them if you're going to be in these public spaces, and then they wouldn't get them. They refused to get them. But if the government had said, okay, the vaccinations are available to those who want them, but they cost $500 each, I'll guarantee you that the same people would have been complaining that they didn't have access to the, I guess what I want to say is, so let me give you another quote by Le Bon. He's talking about the French Revolution. He says, the power of the revolution did not reside in the principles, which for that matter were anything but novel, which it sought to propagate, nor in the institutions which it sought to found. The people care very little for institutions and even less for doctrines. That the revolution was potent indeed, that it made France accept the violence, the murders, the ruin, and the horror of a frightful civil war, that finally it defended itself victoriously against a Europe in arms, was due to the fact that it had founded not a new system of government, but a new religion. In other words, I think people don't realize what's it going to cost to have this new, like, everybody wants this thing, but they don't think about what it would involve. So, like, everybody wants free healthcare, okay, but they don't think about what's going to be involved with that. Okay. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have it, but again, you need to be aware. Okay. It's just like they're having trouble with their health system in Canada, from what I've read.
Right.
And there's a lot of people now upset and want to, privatize it again and all of that. There's going to be a downside no matter what system you have. You just have to decide where your priorities lie. You just can't, like, nobody's going to be able to create a utopian world where everybody gets everything that they want and nobody fights over things, and there's not any kind of price to be paid for the thing. It's like we're able to have everything we want without giving up anything. And that's just unrealistic. And I think a lot of people go into revolution just focusing on what they want, and they're not even thinking about, okay, what's this going to cost? There are some people that do, okay, but there always have to be compromises made, and those end up having ripple effects. So even the United States, being a sovereign nation, we've talked about this, I don't know how many times, but the fact that we had this cultural division among the colonies over slavery from the very beginning has led to what we have now, which is, government by a minority.
Yeah. Well, I think, I would probably want to draw a distinction between some of those, like the French Revolution, the American Revolution, and a true like people's revolution.
Yes.
So, and I think part of that is that those earlier revolutions, even like the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, I think those are ideological revolutions, that they are on ideological lines divided. Whereas if you look at the Zapatistas, they're not like communists. They're not Marxists.
Right.
There's no ideology there.
Right.
It's just, we live here. We should own this land.
Right. Yeah, just basic human morals.
Now, it happens that land distribution is kind of Marxist. It happens that their system of government is a little bit anarchist. But they never claimed any of those ideologies as like, this is how people living in Chiapas have to live.
Right.
This is how you may choose to live, but you can't then go oppressing your neighbor.
Right. They were trying to address social ill as opposed to create a utopian society.
Exactly.
And
there was no like, oh, this is going to be, the perfect place to live. They're all peasant farmers still.
Yeah.
But they're peasant farmers with their freedom.
Yes, exactly. And that's what kind of really worries me. Not only about the United States, but about the world in general. It's this wouldn't all be so worrisome if people weren't so easily swayed, because this is where I'm out of my league here. I probably at some point wouldn't hurt to get somebody in here to talk about this, but let's say, for example, the American War for Independence. I'll call it that. American Revolution. I don't have a problem with that really, but we just know it's a different type of revolution. I really do wonder to what extent was that really about the average citizen, the average farmer, or was the War for Independence really more about the aristocracy?
Well, history would tell you it's the aristocracy, because
that's what I think.
There's no like way of proving this, but there are good reasons to believe that the revolutionaries did not have the people's support.
Yeah, I mean, and the fact that they had to make so many compromises, I think, kind of betrays that fact. The thing is, no taxation without representation. Well, who's going to be upset by that the most? The people that are paying the most taxes. And so it was the aristocracy in America that were sending all this tax money back to England and not getting to send anybody to Parliament.
Right. Well, and then what did they immediately set up their government as after the revolution? Are we being represented, while we're being taxed? Yeah. It's a little bit hypocritical as a current American looking back on that time period, when they're crying.
But that's
no taxation without representation.
But that's the problem. You can't have a regime change or a new system without convincing average people that it's in their interest to make these sacrifices and to risk their lives for this. I don't know.
Well, I mean,
I'd like to think
there were huge problems with like loyalist parties
yes, that's true.
in America.
Right.
That had to be violently resisted by the revolutionary people.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to support the revolution.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, yeah. So you had people that it's like, well, you know, are we really that bad off under England? And I mean, people said the same thing about the Civil War. It's like, well, we didn't have to really fight it. We'd have gotten rid of slavery eventually anyway. I was like,
right.
Okay. Now that one's a little different, a lot different, because it's not just, oh, well, rich people don't want to have to send tax money to England without representation. It was, we're talking about people being enslaved, people being controlled and owned as property. So that's a different
well, and the Southern Rebellion
situation altogether. Yeah.
I think the Southern Rebellion is like pinnacle reactionary rebellion.
Okay, say more about what you're thinking there.
That the Southern reaction to Lincoln's election to president, was a bit of a reactionary hissy fit, and I think is emblematic of how reactionary rebellions tend to be.
Yeah, but don't you think a lot of the Southern aristocracy believed that if they could really secede from the United States, they could just decide amongst themselves that they were going to continue to own slaves?
I mean, yeah, I think that was their goal.
Yes.
And that is by that nature, they are reactionary, right? That's the resistance to change, resistance to egalitarianism as a principle. That is like the reactionary playbook, I think.
Well, and there, you know, and that's kind of what was going on, because this is why, you know, history paints Buchanan as one of the worst presidents, because he tried to defend the status quo and keep everything kind of calm and even. And, you know, Lincoln ended up going down as probably the greatest president in American history, just because he ended up giving his life to a cause. Now, to what extent, you know, was that out of humanitarian respect for the slaves, or was it just to preserve the Union? I don't know.
The Civil War is an interesting time period when we're talking about like revolutionaries.
Yes.
Because you have pre-Civil War revolutionaries like John Brown.
Yes.
Who are failures in their own right, but are necessary precursors to something like the Civil War.
Yeah.
Which I think, I mean, Marx even called it like the greatest left-wing rebellion of all time, or the greatest left-wing revolution of their age was the Civil War, according to Marx.
Yes.
Because it freed the slaves, which was a huge, you know, capitalist foundation. You know, it was a pillar of the capitalist system in America. So would you call the Civil War a revolution, even though there is no regime change? It's a total like policy change.
Yeah, that's true. You know, I think that's a point in history when the law was going to change, and then there was just a certain number of states that were not going to obey that law. And so it had to go down, it had to come to bloodshed to settle that. Are you going to obey that law or not? And they basically were forced into obeying that law.
Yeah. But when you look at like the pre-Civil War era, when you have like the birth of evangelical Christianity,
right,
as a resistance to slavery, as an abolitionist movement, people are going to prison for their entire lives to fight slavery. Can the Civil War really be considered a revolution, even though it had no governmental? I mean, it was ostensibly to defend the status quo, but if you listen to the accounts of normal people who were all gung-ho about the Civil War, it was really about slavery. That's why you have whole troops of Union soldiers singing John Brown's Body, marching into battle.
Yeah. Yes, that's
them,
true.
it's not about the status quo, even though, officially it's about, preserving the Union.
Well, yeah, I think that really is kind of what it is. Again, that's another fight for independence that lost, is really what the Civil War was, more so than a revolution. You didn't have people united across the country. So, even in places where geographically people don't necessarily agree. So like you end up the splitting between West Virginia and Virginia.
Right.
So anyway,
basically what I'm trying to get at is that I think the Civil War, whether or not it's a revolution or just a war to preserve the Union, is a little bit in the eye of the beholder, even at the time it's happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
For slaves, I think that's a revolution.
Well, that's true. The fact that some of the slaves were able to escape and fight for the Union, I think you could classify that as a revolution for them.
Yeah. Well, and if you read like Frederick Douglass,
right,
I think he's a genuine revolutionary.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
After the Civil War, he's calling for a continued revolution in how, he calls it, we've gotten rid of chattel slavery just for wage slavery, which is not really that much better.
Yeah.
This is a former slave saying that. That's not, I mean,
so yeah,
those are powerful words about the wage system in America, which we still have today.
Yeah. So I guess the question is, when is an all-out revolution worth it, or when is it kind of a disproportionate sacrifice for a small amount of change? Now, when you think about the abuses of ownership, and how I don't know, I understand certainly what Frederick Douglass is saying. It wasn't basically, the black people, they gained their freedom, but I don't know they gained anything else other than that.
I think part of it was that they gained the same freedom that the poor, what's the word? The tenant farmer white person had. They have the same freedom as the poor tenant farmer white people had, which was not really any freedom. Yeah, sharecroppers. That's what I'm looking for. Which wasn't really that much freedom,
right,
in a capitalist system, other than you are not somebody else's property officially, but all of your labor is,
right.
Everything you make is somebody else's property. So
yeah, because like to say, well, at least they weren't getting toes chopped off and shackled and this and that and the other, but you still end up with all these beatings and lynchings and effigies, and and didn't have the right to vote.
Now that's not to minimize that chattel slavery is worse.
No. But what I'm saying is that, again, I think you could argue that yes, those gains were significant. Like if you had to live through that, it would be worth the sacrifice.
You didn't have to be separated from your family because somebody wanted to sell you.
Yeah. Right. The unfortunate part is that, like you said, there was still a lot that they were denied. So it was like an ongoing battle. And then they had to fight for those rights as well.
Well, I don't think it's a coincidence that the Civil War is closely followed by the labor movement.
Yeah.
That this was the next frontier of this revolution. And I think that still is going on today.
Well, and that's that may indeed, boy, that would be an interesting academic study. It makes me wonder how many people, like at the time of the American Civil War, if there were, say, wealthy industrialists that knew that mass production and industrialization were right around the corner. And so it was finally time to free up this whole labor force that was dominated by the South and give these folks their freedom so they could work in all their factories up north. I hadn't been quite that cynical before, but it makes me wonder.
I don't know if that's a proper conspiracy, but I wonder if that would have some explanatory power for the ambivalence of the industrial class.
Well, why? I mean, yes, there were people crying out, and there were abolitionist movements, but there were abolitionist movements before then too. And there were people that spoke out against slavery, even at the founding of the country. So why all of a sudden did you have wealthy people backing? Because Lincoln would have never gotten elected if he hadn't been backed by some powerful people. I mean, there's different kinds of stories about that. Like him getting the party, not so much him winning the popular, the national election, but him getting the party nomination.
Right.
And so there was some reason that wealthy people were backing this and deciding now was the time to bust up the South and give these slaves their freedom. I just can't help but think that.
And somebody had to. It's not like Lincoln was elected suddenly or by surprise.
Yeah.
But so somebody had to know that this Civil War was like gonna happen.
Well, and that's another thing too. I don't know if you've ever seen that list of like how many times Lincoln ran for office and lost. I mean, he ran for he got defeated in elections like 7 or 8 times in a row. And I think he got elected to the Senate, but then didn't get reelected. And then he hits all of these defeats, and then all of a sudden he gets swept in and becomes president. I don't know.
Well, and even while he's president, the abolitionists don't have Congress.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. The abolitionist group in Congress is like 4 people.
Yeah. Yeah. And, and he goes into it trying to, they anticipated that there was going to be secession. That's why he chose Andrew Johnson as his running mate.
Right.
Because I think Andrew Johnson, he was from Tennessee, if I'm not mistaken. And that was why Andrew Johnson got impeached as soon as Lincoln was assassinated. The Republicans tried to impeach Johnson and get him out of there because I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I guess there was the Democrat Party there. It was the Whigs that died out with the creation of Republicans.
Yeah.
But as far as I remember, if I'm not mistaken, I think Johnson was a Democrat and Lincoln chose him to try to hopefully
keep the Union together.
Keep the Union together without a war or anything like that. But the Union's the one that decided, the Confederacy's the one that decided on that when they fired on Fort Sumter. And so I think that kind of started the ball rolling, obviously. But so back to the question of, when do revolutions, when is a revolution worth it? I mean, maybe that ends up being hindsight, 2020. It depends. I can't help but think. I remember comedian George Carlin once saying that the problem is people want to fix problems without changing themselves. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. Some people are looking for somebody to just kind of wave their hand or wave a magic wand and their problems go away. But we have to realize that, again, we're all interconnected, and the way we behave and react to others, it's it's like for there to be lasting change, we have to be willing to change with it. Otherwise, you just everything settles back into the same patterns, but you just have new faces in all the different roles. So it's kind of interesting that way. This is where Le Bon, in his analysis, he was talking about how, France got rid of Louis XVI and ended up with Napoleon.
Right.
So it's like, it wasn't really until they were willing to change their way of doing things and change day-to-day life in some respects that you end up having a different system that is significant, and you get past monarchy or whatever.
So when we're to address the big question of this episode, what makes a revolutionary?
Yes.
Do you think that what makes a revolutionary is that ability to change, to go from one mindset to another? Well, in the sense of for Guevara,
yeah,
he writes an extensive diary throughout his life. That's how we know so much about what he thinks about things.
Right.
And early in his life, he writes about how black people are lazy and have done nothing for anybody ever. And then later in his life, he renounces that person. He's like, that person died. And I have completely changed my perspective. This is after, before and after his motorcycle trip where he goes to Miami.
Yeah. Right.
That I think is a pretty significant mindset change.
Yes, absolutely. So I think, okay, there's first the perspective of the leader, the revolutionary leader. And revolutions all require a leader, because otherwise you just end up with, and that's what ends up happening. Like in the French Revolution, when they just, beheaded the king and queen, and then they end up with this kind of state of anarchy, for a while. And then by the time it all sifted out, they ended up with another type of monarchy. So the revolutionary, the leader, there has to be a leader for there to be a successful revolution. The leader, I think, wants to change things. I would like to hope that leaders all have some kind of noble ambitions, that they're not just seeing it as a power grab. I think that power grabbing becomes temptation at some point. That's kind of the way things work. But, the revolutionary is the person that believes in a cause enough to be defined by a cause. And so even if you die for it, that's what you're going to do. So whether you're a Martin Luther or Joan of Arc or Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, you're going to be defined by that. I think that's the mindset of the revolutionary leader. Now, what is the mindset of the average person in embracing a revolution? Well, that can vary as well. But I think a lot of people get swept into revolutions under, let's put it this way. I don't think everybody is going to be able to foresee. And I'm not just talking about a lack of intelligence or anything like that. I don't mean to just imply that necessarily. But let's just say, even in the United States, how many of us really know, if we were elected to Congress or the Senate, could we just step into the job right away? And how long would it take to learn? What kind of things would you have to learn in order to be able to do the job effectively? Whenever we get new people elected into office, it usually takes them a while. And I think that most people that support a revolution aren't really fully aware, and you can't be. I don't know how people could be. You're trusting the judgment of the leader. So this is where revolutions, I think, and people that want to embrace a revolution, it can be exciting on one hand and scary, very scary in another sense. And I mean scary in the sense that, can people be duped into fighting for a revolution that really doesn't benefit them? I think absolutely. And I'm afraid that's kind of partly what's going on. I hate to say this, but it's it makes you wonder, even the stuff that's going on in the United States politics, how much of this really comes down to maybe different groups of billionaires fighting each other, or say CNN fighting Fox News. Yeah, you understand what I'm saying? So like the average person, I mean, truthfully, folks, do we really think that whether Trump or Biden is president, that somehow that's going to cut the price of gasoline in half one way or the other? That is going to have such little impact. Like the things that end up affecting us are like the little intangible things. And it typically ends up being the people who want to exercise their freedom the most. That's where the differences lie. The differences lie in, it's just like, okay, people wonder, it's like, do people in Russia wake up every day and want to commit suicide because they've got a leader like Putin? No, probably they think Putin's okay for the most part. And probably for the most part, I mean, their lives are all right. And basically, as long as you're not opposing Putin, you're okay. It's the people that speak out. That's the place where it tends to make a difference. The people that do not support the status quo. Do we still want a type of society where you're free to speak out and say, I disagree? And I'm not just talking about the politicians. Okay. For example, like even the whole Colin Kaepernick thing with taking a knee during the Star Spangled Banner. I mean, I personally think that that's not the place to do it, but was it really that worth that much getting that riled up over? It wasn't like he was urinating on the flag or spitting on it or stepping on it or something like that. I just don't, it just worries me that so many people can be worked up into a lather over things that aren't really even that significant, you know? I mean, they're significant, but it's like, really? It's like, I would rather live in a society. I don't like to see people burning the flag and things like that. I don't like to see that, but I don't want to live in a country where if you disagree with the government, then they basically censure you or slap the cuffs on you and throw you in prison.
See, I would argue that there's a difference in some of the things that you're addressing and a true revolution. Because I think that's a reactionary rebellion. I don't see how a reactionary could be revolutionary.
Okay.
To me, they're sort of opposite ends of the pole.
Okay. All right. I get that. It just, this kind of rhetoric that, oh, I'd be okay with Trump being the king or, whatever. And if it were just one or two people saying these things, it wouldn't worry me so much. If we just had purely democratic elections with just popular vote, I wouldn't be worrying about this at all. But we don't. We have a system that's rigged toward, we have a system that's rigged towards states where people are backward thinking and reactionary.
But I think when we're talking about these, reactionary revolutionists or reactionary rebellious,
right?
Or, reactionary rebels
yeah.
that are in the Trump camp,
right?
I don't see any path to victory for them that's realistic, other than Project 2025, which I don't know if we've ever actually talked about, but Project 2025 is like the fascist playbook that the Republican Party has adopted.
Yeah.
Where they're going to oust all of the military leaders and bring in the National Guard as like a police state and basically dismantle the government so that Trump has unilateral authority.
Absolute power. Yeah.
That's a fascist takeover power. Would you call the Nazis revolutionary?
Boy, that's a good question.
Because they didn't change the system in any way, but they had the complicit, support of the German people at the same time.
Well, I don't know that. And there you have it. Okay. So revolutions don't change the system for everybody. They only
unless they do, because they have before.
They can, but they don't necessarily affect everybody. Some revolutions only affect a certain segment of the population. I don't want to. Here's the thing. Like, I want to say in some respects that the Nazi movement was revolutionary, although it didn't become a revolution because it didn't result in like a violent change of power. It happened through democratic process. Hitler was elected. Okay. And that would be the same thing that'll happen here. Now, if Trump loses the election and his supporters refuse to accept it and they start riots all over the country, would you call that a revolution? An attempted revolution?
Yeah. I mean, yes, but it would take Trump losing for that to happen.
Well, yes.
Which he probably will.
I hope so.
Yeah, we all have our fingers crossed. The entire nation is sweating about whether Trump's going to lose this election. I think I think you're right. I think I've come around to agree with what you're saying, that revolution is dangerous.
Absolutely.
However, I also think that it's going to be part of the toolkit of political change.
Yeah. Sometimes it's necessary.
Regardless.
Right.
And I think this is part of the reason that the word anarchy and anarchism is more popular with my generation now.
Yes.
Because if you look at the anarchists and their writings, part of what they're talking about is that a lot of times anarchy is portrayed like it's an ideology, like it has ideological values, but it does not. Anarchy is a strategy book, basically.
Yes.
So I have Peter Kropotkin's Anarchist Communism here. Mm-hmm. Can I read a little bit of it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. This is from the second chapter. We have all been bent on studying the dramatic side of revolutions so much, and the practical work of revolutions so little, that we are apt to see only the stage effects, so to speak, of these great movements. The fight of the first days, the barricades. But this fight, this first skirmish, is soon ended. And it is only after the breakdown of the old system that the real work of revolution can be said to begin. Before a popular revolution, the masters of the old order disappear with a surprising rapidity. Its upholders fly the country to plot in safety elsewhere and to devise measures for their return. While some retire to their quarters to await the pleasure of their new government, wealthy citizens pack their trunks and betake themselves to places of safety. The people remain. This is how a revolution is ushered in.
Mm-hmm.
He says, a revolution has been accomplished which considers the needs of the people before schooling them in their duties.
Mm-hmm.
That message, I think, is why anarchism is popular now.
Yeah. Yeah, because, usually, all too often, let's say this, all too often when there's a regime change, the first order of business for the new regime is to protect itself so it doesn't lose the power that it's just attained.
Exactly. And that's what communism is directly, or not communism, anarchism directly addresses.
Yeah.
Because there is no new regime, right? That's what the Zapatistas did. I think that's why they are successful.
Yeah. And you might be able to, I think you could do that regionally. I mean, I think you could do that regionally. Can you do that in a large country?
Is it ever going to be defensible on a large scale?
Well, this is where
from foreign actors and stuff like that.
And this is where, maybe other than a basic military presence, maybe the United States would be better off if we just had, say, regional, like in other words, more things were just, I don't know.
We got to go back to the Greek city-states.
Yeah. And that may be where things are headed. Because like we said before, I think our main, most of the points of tension really have to do with urbanization. Urban areas tend to vote blue and non-urban areas tend to vote red. So there you have it. I don't know that there's a one-size-fits-all approach to government in today's day and age because, well, there's more cultural diversity in the United States. A lot of people, when we say that, people immediately think about race and religion and things like that. But even in terms of rural and small town, large town, city, mega city, that's also different too. Those are different cultures and different cultural settings. We have to decide once and for all what things are going to apply to the nation as a whole. We need to basically rework our whole Bill of Rights and decide what are the basic rights of every American citizen, regardless of where you live. And then the rest of it can be sifted out according to state. And we'll just have to move to the states that where we like what the laws are and what the local values are. Well, anyway. At least internet work and things like that, remote work has made some of that more possible now. Of course, that was possible before, but then that was possible by basically having your own farm. So,
well, and I think if we're going to talk about this as a possibility for how Americans are going to get along, we have to address, I think, that I don't think it's just to expect people to leave their homes.
Yeah.
For
right.
Political refuge.
Right.
I also don't think it's possible for the majority of people.
No, probably not.
I live in a pretty rural place, and I know that in the towns around me, there is a population of trans people that can't leave.
Yeah.
Even though they get the hate that is in this culture directed at them directly in these small towns in America.
Yeah. Well, I think we've, I didn't talk about Kuhn much, and we'll come back to that another time. And
scientific revolutions. I do think there is some similarity.
There are.
In that a scientific revolution happens when a paradigm breaks.
Yes. Yeah, well, we can talk about that because that's another thing that's culturally going on right now. We're in the midst of a paradigm shift. And we have a battle between those that are holding on to the older paradigm and those that want a new paradigm. And so we will, but that's the thing. These paradigms end up intersecting with other paradigms, both cultural and religious. And so maybe we'll unpack that in another episode. So anyway, all right. Is there anything else that we didn't cover?
Have we answered the question, what makes a revolutionary?
Well, I attempted to. I mean, I think the revolutionary is the person that has a vision for what kind of change needs to take place. I'd like to think that I'd like to think that the overwhelming majority of these cases comes out of a humanitarian concern for the plight of other people. To a certain extent, it almost has to, because if there isn't some kind of a need amongst the populace, then you're not going to get people to make sacrifices just so they can have a government position. There's only going to be a revolution when there is some kind of a crisis. There is a need for rapid change. The belief is that this is too important, or it's not going to be possible to make the change unless there is a complete revolt against the current system. And I think, those are kind of the different mindsets that are there. That you're not just going to get there by just gradually changing things, or let's say, even if you do, we're not going to put up with another 20 years of this in hopes that it's going to get better 20 years from now. We want it to change, and it needs to change now. So I think that that's the case. People that believe in a cause so much that they're willing to make sacrifices.
Well, and the revolutionary has, to go back to the physics sort of analogy, has to have enough of their own inertia to change the inertia of the population.
Yes. So, yes, you have to have somebody that's got the vision, the organizational skills, and then even the charisma to rally people to get involved in the revolution and be willing and to convince people it's worth the cost to bring about these changes. And then you have to gain the support of people that have access to means. So if it's going to be an armed revolution, you got to find people who are going to supply you arms.
Yeah, well, and I think that's part of your social inertia is I have the means to accomplish this. I just need the support.
Well, yes. So in that sense, even the American Revolution is truly a revolution because we were able to win with the support of France. Without the support of France, we probably would have never won that battle, won that war. So anyway, and then it ended up costing Louis XVI his life for bankrupting his own country, trying to help the United States, like the colonies, defeat England.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is where the difference is between just like a radical and a revolutionary.
Yeah.
I'm starting to think that maybe you don't have to be radical to be a revolutionary. The changes you're calling for don't have to be crazy. That's right. I think a reactionary becomes revolutionary when they amass a following.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think there are small-scale revolutions and large-scale revolutions. It just depends on how much needs to be changed. But yeah, there's got to be at least some kind of structural or change of power has to change hands anyway.
Yeah, I think we've kind of already done this, but the interesting question is not what is a revolution, but how does a revolution?
Yeah.
What makes a good revolution? It comes to the ethical question of how is a revolution successful and what makes them good or evil?
Yeah. Well, we could, okay. So in the ethicality of it, I think it would depend on the ethics of the cause, the power dynamics, the risk that people are being asked to take in terms of how much they're going to benefit for it. Or what kind of benefit there's going to come out. I don't think there's anything wrong with asking people to sacrifice in behalf of other people, okay, to help other people, because at some point that needs to happen, and that's a humanitarian thing to do. There's other things we could say. I mean, every revolution probably has, it's just like every organization. There are parts of it that are ethical, and there are parts of it that they're probably not as ethical as they should be.
Yeah. Well, and perhaps the true foil for a reactionary is a progressive.
Yeah.
Because I think that's where the ethical difference is, right? So for the reactionary, we talked about the ideology is not moral or ethically minded in any way. It's just identity based.
Well,
whereas for the progressive, it is a moral issue that they are reacting to.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's the challenge that Biden faces in this election, because the person who is trying to take some kind of a centrist position and defend the status quo is going to get shot at from both sides.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And
well, and it's a bad position to be in when the person on the right is a revolutionary-minded person like Trump is.
Yes.
Whereas the progressives in America are not revolutionary-minded. They are reform-minded.
Yes.
At least in government.
Yeah. So, oh my. Yeah, there's more we can unpack here when we apply some of this analysis. Yeah. And maybe we will. We can talk about the American cultural divide a little more in some of these terms. And some other things we can unpack too. So, well, how about if we put a bow on this?
Yeah, I think this has helped me organize and clarify how I think about these issues.
Yeah, me too. Me too. I've enjoyed listening to the bios of the info that you provided. That was really helpful. I honestly didn't know that much about Che Guevara. I've always heard his name, and I knew he was involved with the Cuban Revolution, but anyway, it kind of helped me put it in context.
I think he's the pure revolutionist.
Yeah. Yeah.
He has no interest in the power. He just wants the revolution.
Right.
He just happens to be progressive as well.
Yes, absolutely. We've enjoyed doing this. Don't know how revolutionary this broadcast has been today, but hopefully we got into that mindset a bit. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for spending this time with us. And if the world doesn't end before then, we'll be back next week with another thrilling episode. We look forward to spending that time with you, and you take care.